She built her cabin on a rock pile, and everyone laughed at her. Gunnar Rolfsson, who had survived 4 Minnesota winters and buried a wife and infant son to the cold, told her plainly, "If you stay here, they will watch you fail, and then they will freeze." She had $7, 2 children under 7, and needed a foundation she had never built. On January the 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 53 degrees in 7 hours. But 5 months earlier, Ingrid Torstad had never laid a single stone in her life. She arrived in Otter Tail County, Minnesota in May of 1887 with $9 in her pocket, 2 children under the age of 7, and a husband's grave still fresh in the churchyard back in Fargo. Lars had died in February, pneumonia that turned to something worse during the brutal cold snap when temperatures dropped to 43 below and stayed there for 11 days. The doctor said his lungs had filled with fluid. Ingrid knew better. Lars had worked himself hollow, trying to make their rented farm pay, and when the cold came, there was nothing left inside him to fight it. The homestead claim had been his dream. 160 acres of free land, 5 years of work, and it would belong to them forever. Lars had filed the papers in November of '86, paid the $14 fee, and planned to move the family in spring. Then winter came early and hard, and Lars went into the ground instead of onto the land. The law didn't care about widows' grief. The Homestead Act required residents within 6 months of filing, or the claim was forfeit. Ingrid had until May 31st to reach the property, build a dwelling, and begin the improvements that would prove her intent to stay. She had $9 after the burial costs. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Maya and a 5-year-old son named Eric. She had no horse, no wagon, no tools, and no family within 1,000 miles. What she did have was a train ticket that Lars had purchased before he died, round trip from Fargo to Fergus Falls, the nearest station to their claim. She cashed in the return half for $2.40. Then she hired a man with a wagon to haul what little she owned, the remaining 18 miles, to the quarter section that was supposed to be her future. The land sat along the Alexandria Moraine, a rolling ridge of glacial debris that the ice sheets had dumped across Minnesota 10,000 years ago. The soil was rich, thick black loam over clay, but the fields were studded with stones. Granite boulders the size of washtubs, flat slabs of gneiss, rounded cobbles that the frost pushed to the surface every spring as if the earth itself were trying to spit them out. Farmers cursed these stones. They broke plows. They had to be dragged to the edges of fields and piled into walls that served no purpose except to mark where the nuisance had been dumped. Ingrid looked at those stones and saw something else entirely. Her father had been a builder in Valdres, Norway, not a carpenter, a stone man. He had raised the foundation for the village stabber, the 2-story storehouse where families kept grain and cured meat safe from moisture and vermin. The stabber stood on stone pillars, lifted 2 feet off the ground, and her father had explained why 100 times. "The earth moves in winter," he told her when she was Maya's age. "Ice grows in the soil like bread rising. It pushes up, it cracks, it breaks whatever sits on it. But if you lift the building above the earth, the ice has nothing to grip. The house floats while the ground heaves beneath it." She had watched him stack those stones without mortar, fitting each one against its neighbors so the weight pressed down and locked them in place. Dry stone, he called it. The gaps let water drain through instead of freezing inside the wall. The whole structure could shift and settle and shift again without cracking, because nothing held it rigid. It breathed with the seasons. That was 20 years ago and 5,000 miles away. Ingrid had not touched a stone since she was 12 years old. She did not know if she could remember what her father had taught her. She did not know if the stones in Minnesota would stack the same as the stones in Valdres. She only knew that every cabin she had seen since arriving in America sat directly on the dirt, and every spring those cabins tilted a little more. The wagon driver helped her unload her trunk and her children at the edge of her claim. The nearest neighbor was a man named Gunnar Rolfsson, whose cabin sat 3/4 of a mile to the north. Rolfsson had been in Minnesota for 4 years. He had survived the hard winter of 80 to 81 when snow fell for 7 months straight and trains stopped running until May. He had survived the killing cold of 86 to 87 when half the cattle in the territory froze standing up. He had buried his first wife in the second winter and his infant son in the third. When Rolfsson saw the wagon pull away and the woman standing alone with 2 small children beside a trunk in the middle of an empty field, he walked over to see what kind of fool had arrived. "You're Lars Torstad's widow," he said. It was not a question. Word traveled fast in country this empty. Ingrid nodded. "I am here to prove up the claim." Rolfsson looked at the children. Maya pressed herself against her mother's leg. Eric stared at the big man with open curiosity. "You have no cabin," Rolfsson said. "I will build one." "You have no horse." "I will manage." "You have no husband." Ingrid felt the words land like a slap, but she kept her voice steady. "My husband is dead. The claim is not." Rolfsson studied her for a long moment. His face was weathered leather, cracked by sun and cold and loss. When he spoke again, his voice carried no cruelty, only the flat certainty of a man stating facts. "A woman alone cannot build a cabin before winter," he said. "You cannot break sod for a garden and stack logs for walls and tend children and haul water from the creek. And even if you did, even if you built something that stands, the cold will find the gaps. The frost will heave your foundation. By March, your door will not close. By next October, the walls will lean. This is not Norway. This is not even Dakota. This is Minnesota, and Minnesota kills people who come unprepared." He paused, letting the words settle. "You have 2 children," Rolfsson said. "If you stay here, they will watch you fail, and then they will freeze, go back to Fargo, find work in town, let someone else have this land who can hold it." Ingrid felt Maya's fingers tighten on her skirt. She thought about the $9 in her pocket, 7 now, after paying the wagon driver. She thought about the rooming house in Fargo where they had stayed for 2 weeks after Lars died, and the landlady who had made clear that charity had limits. She thought about her daughter's face when she explained they had no home, and her son's voice asking when Papa was coming back. She looked at Gunnar Rolfsson, who had survived 4 Minnesota winters and lost a wife and child to the cold, and she said, "Show me where the creek is." Rolfsson stared at her. Then he shook his head, turned, and walked back toward his cabin. He did not look back. That night, Ingrid and her children slept under the wagon tarp she had brought from Fargo, laid across a depression in the ground that blocked some of the wind. The temperature dropped to 41 degrees. It was only May. By the end of her first week on the claim, Ingrid understood exactly how impossible her situation was. A proper cabin for Minnesota winters needed to be at least 16 by 20 feet. Anything smaller would not hold enough heat. The walls needed to be 8 inches thick minimum, either hewn logs chinked with mud and grass, or milled lumber if you could afford it. The roof needed a steep pitch to shed snow and tight enough joints to keep out the wind-driven ice crystals that found every crack. But before any of that, you needed a foundation. And this was where Ingrid's neighbors began to watch her with puzzled frowns. Most homesteaders did what their fathers had done in Ohio or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. They cleared a patch of ground, leveled it roughly, and laid their first logs directly on the packed earth. Some placed flat stones at the corners to keep the wood off the dirt. The more careful builders dug a shallow trench and filled it with rocks to create a crude footing. None of this took more than a day or two. Every hour spent on foundation was an hour not spent on walls, roof, garden, or the 100 other tasks that determined whether a family survived their first winter. Ingrid did not do any of these things. Instead, she began collecting stones. She started with the small ones, cobbles she could lift with both hands and carry to a growing pile near the center of her claim. Then she moved to the larger stones, the ones that required dragging. She found a thick branch, wedged one end under a boulder, and levered it onto a piece of canvas that she pulled behind her like a sled. Stone by stone, day by day, the pile grew. Her neighbor to the south, a Norwegian bachelor named Petter Haugen, rode over on the third day to see what she was doing. Haugen had arrived 2 years earlier and built his cabin in the standard way, logs on leveled earth, cornerstones for spacing. He was a practical man who measured success by acres broken and bushels harvested. He found Ingrid dragging a slab of granite that must have weighed 60 pounds, her face streaked with sweat, her children sitting in the shade of the stone pile eating hard bread. "What is this?" Hogan asked, gesturing at the pile. "Foundation," Ingrid said. She did not stop dragging. "Foundation? For what?" "For the cabin." Haugen dismounted and walked around the pile. There must have been 2 tons of stone already, and Ingrid showed no sign of stopping. "You are building a foundation from dry stone?" he asked. "Piers?" Ingrid nodded, still pulling. "That will take weeks." "You do not have weeks. You have," he calculated in his head, 4 months until first freeze, maybe less. You need walls. You need a roof. You need wood stacked for fuel. You need a garden in the ground. I need a cabin that will still stand in 5 years. Ingrid interrupted. She released the canvas strap and straightened her back, wincing. "Your cabin, the one you built when you arrived. How much does your door stick when you close it now?" Haugen's face changed. His door stuck badly, had since the second winter. He had to lift and shove to get it to latch, and the gap at the bottom let in a draft that no amount of rags could block. "That is just settling," he said. "All cabins settle." "Mine will not." Haugen looked at the pile. He looked at the woman, small and alone, with blisters visible on her palms and dirt ground into the fabric of her dress. He looked at the 2 children watching silently from their patch of shade. "You are wasting time," he said finally. "Time you do not have. This is not how we do things here." "This is how my father did things in Norway," Ingrid said. "His buildings are still standing after 50 years. Your cabin is 2 years old, and your door does not close." Haugen's jaw tightened. "Your father had help. You have no one. You have 2 children who need food and a roof before snow falls. Every hour you spend playing with rocks is an hour closer to watching them starve." He mounted his horse and looked down at her. "The Gustafsons 3 miles west lost their claim last year. They could not prove up in time. Their cabin is still there, roof collapsed, but the walls stand. If you worked fast, you might salvage enough lumber to build something real. I will help you haul it. Rolfson will help. We are not monsters." Ingrid met his eyes. "I do not want the Gustafsons' cabin. I want my own." Haugen shook his head. "Then you are a fool, and your children will pay for it." He rode away without looking back. That night Ingrid lay awake under the tarp, listening to her children breathe. Maya had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted by a day of helping carry small stones and watching her mother work. Eric had asked again about Papa, and Ingrid had held him until the question stopped and his body went slack with sleep. The stars were brilliant overhead. In Fargo, the gas lamps washed them out, but here the sky was black velvet pricked with 1,000 points of light. Somewhere out in the darkness, a wolf howled. Another answered. Haugen was not wrong.
She was spending days on foundation work while her neighbors had already broken sod and begun stacking logs.
She had no cabin, no garden, no woodpile. She had $7.30, 2 children who needed to eat, and a growing collection of stones that might prove nothing except her father's lessons were 20 years out of date. But she kept seeing Rolfson's cabin, the way it listed slightly to the south, the cracks in the chinking where the logs had shifted, the makeshift wooden blocks he had wedged under one corner to keep the floor level. His cabin was 4 years old, and it was already dying. The frost had gotten into its bones, and every winter would make it worse. She was not going to build a cabin that died. By mid-June, Ingrid had gathered nearly 4 tons of fieldstone. The pile stood as tall as her shoulders in places, a cairn of granite and gneiss that drew stares from anyone who passed on the road half a mile to the west. The stares turned to whispers. The whispers turned to open mockery. Silas Brennan ran the general store in Fergus Falls, 18 miles away. He also held mortgages on 3 homesteads in the area and extended credit to a dozen more. He was the kind of man who kept careful track of which settlers were likely to succeed and which were likely to fail, because the failures often meant he could buy their improvements for pennies on the dollar when they abandoned their claims. Brennan made it his business to ride out and inspect new homesteaders. He arrived at Ingrid's claim in late June, his horse picking its way between the stones she had not yet collected. He found her building. Not the cabin, she had not started the cabin. She was building the foundation, 1 stone at a time. She had dug 8 shallow pits, each about 2 feet square and 18 inches deep, arranged in a rectangle 16 feet by 20. Into each pit, she was stacking stones in the dry stone manner her father had taught her, largest at the bottom, progressively smaller toward the top, each stone fitted against its neighbors without mortar, the weight holding everything in place. 4 of the piers were complete, rising 2.5 feet above the ground. She was working on the 5th. Brennan dismounted and walked slowly around the worksite, his boots crunching on scattered stone chips. He said nothing for a long time. Ingrid kept working, fitting a stone into place, testing its stability, adjusting, testing again. Finally, Brennan spoke. "Mrs. Torstad." Ingrid looked up but did not stop working. "Mr. Brennan, I heard you were building something unusual out here." He gestured at the stone piers. "I did not believe it. Now you see it is true." Brennan walked closer, examining one of the completed piers. He pushed against it with his hand. It did not move. "Dry stone," he said. "Like the old country." "Like Norway, yes." "Your husband was Norwegian?" "My father was a builder in Valdres. He taught me this when I was a child." Brennan nodded slowly. He was a calculating man, and Ingrid could see him doing calculations now, but not the kind she expected. He was not adding up her chances of success. He was adding up what he could take from her when she failed. "Mrs. Torstad," he said, "I came out here to offer you a loan, enough to buy lumber for a proper cabin, seed for a garden, maybe a mule to help with the heavy work. The interest is reasonable, 12% annual. You would have 5 years to pay it back." Ingrid straightened. Her back ached. Her hands were raw. "And if I cannot pay? Then the improvements become mine." Brennan smiled. It was not a kind smile. "But you would have a cabin, a real cabin, with a sawn lumber floor and glass windows and a door that latches. Not," he gestured at the stone piers, "whatever this is. This is a foundation that will not heave." Brennan's smile did not waver. "Mrs. Torstad, I have been in this territory for 9 years. I have seen 100 homesteaders come and go. The ones who survive are the ones who build fast and plant fast and accept that their first cabin will need repairs. The ones who try to build perfect die waiting for perfect. Winter does not care about your Norwegian stonework. Winter cares about whether you have walls and a roof and enough wood to burn. He leaned closer, and his voice dropped. Your children are thin, he said. I can see their ribs when the wind presses their shirts flat. You have been here 6 weeks, and you have no garden, you have no cabin, you have no firewood, you have a pile of rocks and a theory. By October, that pile of rocks will be your gravestone, and those children will be in an orphanage in St. Paul. Ingrid felt the words like physical blows. She looked toward where Maya and Eric were playing at the edge of the stone pile, stacking small rocks into towers and knocking them down. I do not want your loan, she said. Brennan nodded, unsurprised. Then I will see you in the spring, if you are still here. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. By mid-July, all 8 piers were complete. They stood in a perfect rectangle, 2.5 feet tall, each one solid enough to hold the corner of a building. Ingrid walked among them in the evening light, running her hands over the fitted stones, checking for any that had shifted. None had. The weight held everything in place, just as her father had promised. Now she needed logs. The nearest timber was along the creek that ran through the northwest corner of her claim, a thin ribbon of cottonwood and box elder, with a few larger oaks further back from the water. None of it was ideal building material. Cottonwood warped and cracked as it dried. Box elder was soft and prone to rot, but oak was dense and heavy and hard to work, especially for someone with no experience felling trees and no saw large enough to cut logs. She did not have a choice. She had spent all her time on the foundation. Her neighbors had been cutting and stacking logs since May. The best timber on the surrounding claims was already gone. Ingrid walked into the woods with her axe, the one piece of equipment Lars had insisted on buying new, a good steel head from a smith in Fargo, and looked at the trees. They were not large by Norwegian standards, but they were tall enough and straight enough. She selected a cottonwood about 10 inches in diameter, spat on her palms, and swung. The axe bit into the bark. Wood chips flew. She swung again. 2 hours later, the tree fell. It was barely 15 feet long once she trimmed the branches, shorter than she needed, which meant she would have to join sections at the piers instead of running single logs the full length of each wall. More work, more time, more chances for gaps that would let in cold. She dragged the log back toward the foundation. It took most of the afternoon. At this rate, she calculated, she would need 60 days to cut enough timber for the walls. She had 90 days until first hard freeze. That left 30 days to raise the walls, build the roof, chink the gaps, and gather firewood for winter. Impossible. The math was impossible. She kept cutting. Rolfson came by in early August. He stood at the edge of her claim and watched her drag a log out of the woods, her face red with effort, her children trailing behind carrying branches for kindling. You have walls now, he observed. A dozen logs lay stacked near the foundation, seasoning in the summer sun. Part of walls, Ingrid said. She did not stop to talk. You need a raising bee. Get the neighbors together for a day. Everyone brings their strength. The cabin goes up by sunset. This is how it is done. I know how it is done. Ingrid released the log and straightened, pressing her hand to the small of her back. But the neighbors will not come for me. Rolfson said nothing. They both knew she was right. She was the woman building the rock pile, the widow wasting time on foundations while sensible people built actual cabins. She had refused Haugen's offer of salvage lumber. She had refused Brennan's loan. The community had decided she was either proud or crazy, and neither one earned a raising bee. I will come, Rolfson said quietly. One man is not much, but it is more than none. Ingrid looked at him, this weathered farmer who had told her to leave, who had warned her she would kill her children,
who had walked away without looking back. "Why?" she asked. Rolfson was silent for a moment. "Because you're still here," he said finally. "Everyone said you would quit by now. Brennan has been telling people in town that you will be gone by September. Haugen thinks you have lost your mind, but you are still here and you are still building, and those children are still alive." He shrugged. "I have seen a lot of people quit. I have not seen many people stay when everyone said they should quit." He nodded toward the foundation. "Your stone piers. They are good work. I have never seen a foundation like that in America. Only in the old country on my grandfather's farm." "You are Norwegian?" "Rolfson. Rolf's son. My grandfather came from Sogndal." He almost smiled. "I thought I had forgotten everything about that place, but I watched you build those piers, and I remembered. He built the same way. Dry stone, no mortar. 'The earth moves,' he used to say. 'Build something that can move with it.'" Ingrid felt something loosen in her chest. 6 weeks of silence and mockery and solitary labor, and here was one person who understood. "The raising bee," she said. "When?" "Saturday," Rolfson said. "I will talk to Haugen. He's a stubborn man, but he's not a cruel one. He will come, even if only to prove you wrong." The raising bee was nothing like the celebrations Ingrid had heard about from other homesteaders. A dozen families gathering with food and music, the walls going up in a single joyful day, the community knitting itself together through shared labor. 3 men came, Rolfson, Haugen, and a young bachelor named Anders Lindqvist, whose claim bordered hers to the east. Lindqvist said almost nothing, but he worked hard and well, positioning logs while the others notched and lifted. Haugen grumbled constantly about the foundation. "Too high, all this stone wasted. We could have had her in a cabin a month ago." But he did not slow down. Rolfson simply worked, hour after hour, a silent engine of competence. By midday, the first course of logs sat on the stone piers. By evening, the walls were 4 feet high. Ingrid's arms burned with exhaustion, but she kept pace with the men, notching logs, hauling timber, mixing clay for the chinking that would seal the gaps. "We will finish tomorrow," Rolfson said as the sun dropped toward the horizon. "The roof will take another day after that, with just the 4 of us." Haugen looked at the structure taking shape. The walls rose from the stone piers with a visible gap between the lowest log and the ground, 18 inches of airspace that made the cabin look like it was floating. "It does look strange," Haugen admitted, "but the logs are true. The joints are tight. If the chinking holds—" He shook his head. "We will see. Winter will tell us everything." That night, Ingrid fed the men the last of her flour made into flatbread, with wild onions from the creek and strips of dried venison that Lindqvist had brought from his own stores. It was a poor meal, and everyone knew it, but no one said anything. Haugen even complimented the bread. By Sunday evening, the cabin stood complete. 16 feet by 20, walls 8 logs high, a roof of split poles covered with sod cut from the prairie. Ingrid had traded her best dress, the one she had worn to Lars's funeral, to a family passing through, in exchange for enough tar paper to wrap between the sod layers and keep out rain. The floor was packed earth, but the earth was dry for the first time in months because the cabin sat above it instead of on it. Rolfson walked around the structure one final time, testing the chinking, pushing against corners. "It is solid," he said. "Better than solid. This cabin will hold." "Until winter," Haugen added. "Then we will know." Ingrid looked at what she had built. 4 months of labor. Every stone fitted by her own hands, every log dragged from the woods by her own strength. The foundation that everyone said was a waste of time, now invisible beneath the walls it supported.
Winter will come, she said, and I will be here when it does. By late September, the cabin was as ready as Ingrid could make it. The chinking had dried and been reapplied twice, filling cracks that appeared as the logs settled onto the pier foundation. The door hung true, no sticking, no gaps, and the single window facing south was sealed tight with greased paper that let in dim light while keeping out wind. A small iron stove sat in one corner, its pipe rising through the sod roof, and Ingrid had stacked 3 cords of firewood against the north wall. 3 cords. She needed at least 5 to guarantee survival through a hard winter, and a truly brutal winter, like the one in 80 to 81, might require 7 or 8. But she had run out of time. The garden she had finally planted in July had yielded a thin harvest of potatoes and turnips, barely enough to fill 2 barrels. She had traded labor to Lindqvist for a share of his wheat, enough for bread if she rationed carefully. The children had grown over the summer, leaner and harder, but still alive. The first frost came on October 2nd. Ingrid woke to find ice crystals on the inside of the window and her breath visible in the gray dawn light. She lit the stove and watched the cabin warm, checking for drafts, for gaps where cold air might sneak through. There were none. The walls were tight. The floor was dry. The foundation, her father's foundation, built from stones the earth itself had pushed up, held everything exactly level. Haugen came by a week later. Ingrid saw him from the window, walking around the outside of her cabin, bending down to peer at the gap between the lowest log and the ground. When he straightened, his face was troubled. She opened the door. "Good morning, Mr. Haugen." "Mrs. Torstad." He nodded toward the foundation. "There is no frost damage." "No." "My cabin already has cracks in the chinking. The ground beneath the southeast corner has risen almost an inch. The door scrapes when I close it." Ingrid said nothing. Haugen looked at the gap between her cabin and the earth, that 18 inches of empty air where ice crystals glittered on the frozen ground but could not reach the wood above. "My grandfather built like this," he said slowly. "In Telemark. I thought it was old country foolishness." He paused. "Perhaps I was wrong." "Perhaps." He met her eyes. "Winter is not here yet. First frost is nothing. Wait until January. Wait until the temperature drops to 40 below and the wind cuts through everything. Then we will see if your rock pile was worth the trouble." He walked away without waiting for a response. Ingrid watched him go. Then she went back inside, closed the door that still swung freely on its hinges, and fed another log to the stove. Winter was not here yet, but it was coming, and she would be ready. The temperature dropped steadily through October and November. By the first week of December, the creek had frozen solid, and the snow lay 2 feet deep across the prairie. Ingrid fell into a rhythm of survival. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire, melt snow for water, cook a thin breakfast of porridge for the children, work during the short hours of daylight, repairing, hauling firewood from her dwindling stack, checking the animals in the tiny lean-to she had built against the cabin's south wall, then retreat inside as darkness fell. The cabin held. No drafts crept through the walls. The door closed true. The floor stayed dry even as ice formed on the ground outside. When Ingrid walked the property in the mornings, she could see the frost heave at work everywhere, the ground rippling and buckling as ice lenses formed beneath the surface, stones being pushed slowly upward through the soil, but under her cabin, suspended on its piers, the process that was destroying everyone else's foundation simply did not matter. By Christmas, she had burned through a cord and a half of wood, 2 cords remaining, 40 more days of winter minimum, probably 60. It would be close. It would be very close. The new year came and went. 1888 arrived with temperatures that dropped to 12 below zero and stayed there. Ingrid rationed wood with fanatic precision.
letting the cabin grow cold during the day while the children bundled in every blanket she owned, then banking the fire at night to preserve precious fuel.
They ate the same meal every day, potato soup with a handful of grain, and Ingrid felt her own body consuming itself, her ribs growing visible, her face going hollow. January 12th, 1888, dawned warm, impossibly, absurdly warm. The temperature climbed above freezing before noon. Children ran outside without coats. Settlers threw open doors that had been sealed shut for weeks, letting air that almost smelled like spring flood into stuffy cabins. In Fergus Falls, people stood on the boardwalk and turned their faces toward the sun. Ingrid watched her children play in the softening snow and felt the warmth on her skin and thought, "This is wrong. This is not how winter works." By mid-afternoon, the sky to the northwest had turned a strange color, not the gray of normal clouds, but something darker, almost purple. The wind died completely. The world went silent. Then the cold came. It came like a wall. One moment the air was mild. The next moment it was 20 degrees colder and dropping. The wind hit at the same instant, screaming out of the northwest at 40, 50, 60 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles. The temperature plummeted so fast that the warmth of the morning seemed like a dream. Ingrid grabbed Maya's hand and screamed for Eric. The boy was 30 feet away, building a snow fort, and in the few seconds it took him to run toward her voice, his face went white from the cold. She shoved both children through the door, slammed it behind them, and pressed her back against the wood while the wind shrieked outside like a living thing. The temperature dropped 53 degrees in 7 hours. By nightfall, it was 11 below zero. By midnight, it was 29 below. By dawn of January 13th, the thermometer Ingrid had hung outside her window read 42 degrees below zero, and the wind still howled. The schoolhouse blizzard had arrived. I'll expand Chunk 2 significantly, deepening the crisis, adding more sensory detail, extending the validation sequences, and building out the confrontations. This will bring it to the target 5,000 to 6,000 word range. The blizzard did not stop. For 3 days, the wind screamed without pause. It came from the northwest in waves, each gust hitting the cabin like a physical blow, testing every joint, every seam, every inch of chinking that Ingrid had packed between the logs. Snow drove horizontally through the air so thick that she could not see the woodpile 15 feet from the door. The world beyond her walls had become a white void, a howling emptiness that wanted nothing more than to swallow her cabin whole. Ingrid kept the stove burning at the minimum level that would prevent the cabin from becoming a tomb. She had calculated it precisely during the fall, burning test fires and measuring how long each log lasted, how much heat was needed to keep the water bucket from freezing solid. Now those calculations meant the difference between life and death. Too much fire, and she would run out of wood before spring. Too little, and the cold would creep in, degree by degree, until her children stopped shivering and started sleeping and never woke up. She fed the stove one split log every 90 minutes. No more. The cabin held at 28 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough that ice formed on the inside of the window, but not cold enough to kill. Not yet. Maya and Eric huddled together on the bed Ingrid had built into the corner, a frame of split poles covered with a straw-stuffed mattress and every blanket and piece of clothing they owned. They had stopped asking when the storm would end. They had stopped asking for more food. They lay in silence, conserving warmth, conserving energy, their small bodies pressed together under the mound of fabric like animals in a den. On the second day, Eric developed a cough. It started small, a dry rasp in his throat that he tried to hide, turning his face into the pillow when the spasms came. Ingrid noticed anyway. A mother always notices. She pressed her palm to his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his skin, far too much heat for a body that should have been conserving every calorie against the cold. By evening, his forehead was slick with sweat, and the cough had deepened into something wet and ugly, a bubbling sound in his chest that Ingrid recognized with sick certainty. She had heard that sound before. She had heard it in Lars's chest during the last week of his life, when the pneumonia had filled his lungs with fluid and stolen his breath one rattling gasp at a time. She held Eric through the night, her body curved around his small form, feeling him shake with each spasm. The wind shrieked against the walls, the stove crackled and popped. The temperature outside dropped to 47 degrees below zero, colder than the night Lars had died, colder than anything Ingrid had ever experienced, colder than she had believed possible. And the cabin held. She could hear the timbers creak as the wood contracted, the logs shrinking slightly in the terrible cold, but nothing cracked, nothing shifted. No gaps opened in the chinking. No drafts crept through invisible seams to steal the precious heat from the stove. The floor remained dry, even as frost built up on the ground outside, white crystals spreading across the frozen earth in patterns that looked almost beautiful if you did not know what they meant. The stone piers beneath her feet bore the weight of the cabin exactly as her father had promised they would. The ice that was forming in the ground, ice that was heaving and buckling and destroying foundations across the territory, had nothing to grip. The cabin floated above the destruction like a boat on a frozen sea. On the third morning, the wind finally stopped. The silence was almost more shocking than the noise had been. Ingrid lay still for a long moment, listening, waiting for the next gust. None came. The world outside had gone quiet, the storm exhausted, the killing cold settling in to finish what the wind had started. She eased out from under the blankets, leaving Eric still sleeping, his breathing ragged but steady. Maya watched her with hollow eyes from her side of the bed. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Ingrid pulled on every piece of clothing she owned, 2 dresses, 3 pairs of stockings, Lars's old coat that hung past her knees, a wool scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed. Then she opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall of knives. Every exposed inch of skin burned. Her eyes watered instantly, the tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. The air itself seemed to crackle, so cold that the moisture in her breath turned to ice crystals before it left her mouth. A tiny cloud of frozen fog that hung in the air and slowly drifted to the ground. The landscape was unrecognizable. Snow had drifted against the north wall of the cabin up to the roofline, a great white wave frozen in mid-crash. The prairie had become a featureless plain, all contours erased, all landmarks buried. The horizon merged with the sky in a seamless gray blur so that she could not tell where the land ended and the heavens began. She checked the thermometer she had hung on the south wall, sheltered from the wind. The mercury had retreated so far down the tube that she had to bend close to read it. 38 degrees below zero. Eric needed medicine. He needed a doctor. He needed warmth and rest and food that she did not have, care that she could not provide. The nearest doctor was in Fergus Falls, 18 miles away, and Ingrid had no horse, no sleigh, no way to travel except on foot through snow that reached her waist in the drifts and her knees even on the windswept flats. She was calculating the impossible math. How far could she walk before the cold killed her? How long could she leave the children alone? What were the chances of reaching help and returning before Eric's fever burned through whatever strength remained in his small body when she saw movement on the white plain to the north? A dark shape, low and slow, barely visible against the snow. It resolved gradually into a human figure,
moving with the steady rhythm of a man on skis. Behind him, something scraped across the frozen surface. A small sled, perhaps, piled with supplies. Rolfson. He reached her cabin 20 minutes later, his beard white with frost, his eyebrows crusted with ice, his eyes red-rimmed and weeping from the cold. He did not speak until he had come inside and stood by the stove, his body shaking uncontrollably as the warmth seeped back into his frozen flesh. His hands were white at the fingertips. The first stage of frostbite, Ingrid knew, though she did not say so. She gave him hot water with a precious spoonful of sugar dissolved in it. He drank it in 3 long swallows, his teeth chattering against the rim of the cup. "The Hendricksons are dead," he said finally. "All 4 of them." Ingrid felt the words land like a physical blow, like the flat of an axe striking her chest. The Hendricksons lived 2 miles to the southeast, a young couple named Anders and Britta with 2 small children, a boy and a girl. They had arrived in the territory only 18 months ago, newer to the land than Ingrid herself. Anders had been a clerk in Chicago before the dream of free land drew him west. Britta had grown up on a farm in Wisconsin, but had never experienced a winter like the ones that waited in Minnesota. They had built their cabin in September, racing against the coming cold, following every piece of advice the experienced settlers gave them. Logs on packed earth, flat stones at the corners, good tight chinking, a solid roof, standard construction, normal construction, the way everyone built. "What happened?" Ingrid asked, though she already knew. Rolfson stared at the stove, at the small flames dancing behind the iron grate, at the heat that was slowly bringing feeling back to his frozen hands. The foundation heaved during the warm spell that morning, January 12th, when the temperature rose above freezing. The ground thawed just enough for water to seep down into the soil around their foundation stones. Then the cold hit. He paused, and Ingrid could see him reliving it, the visit to the Hendrickson cabin, the discovery of what waited inside. The water froze, expanded. The ice pushed up under the southeast corner of the cabin and lifted it 6 inches in a single night. The logs cracked apart at the corner joint. The chinking fell out in chunks. By midnight, there was a gap in their wall you could put your fist through. They could not seal it? They tried. Anders stuffed it with blankets, with clothing, with everything they had. But the wind was 60 miles an hour and 40 below zero. Every time he blocked one gap, the cold found another. The cabin was bleeding heat faster than the stove could replace it. Rolfson's voice dropped, going flat and distant. They burned everything they had trying to stay warm. The furniture first, the table, the chairs, the bed frame. Then the floorboards. Anders ripped up his own floor and fed it to the stove, plank by plank, while his wife held the children and prayed. When the fuel ran out, they huddled together in the corner and waited. There was nothing else to do. He looked up, and his eyes were empty. By the time I reached them, they had been frozen for 2 days. Anders was still holding the axe he had used to chop up the furniture. Britta had both children in her arms. The little girl was wearing a blue ribbon in her hair. Ingrid remembered that ribbon. She had seen it in October, when Britta had walked over to introduce herself, bringing her children to meet the widow on the neighboring claim. The girl, her name was Sigrid, Ingrid remembered now. Sigrid Hendrickson, 4 years old, had been proud of that ribbon. She had shown it to Maya, touching it with careful fingers, explaining that her mother had bought it in Chicago before they moved west. "How many others?" Ingrid asked. "I do not know yet." The storm was 3 days. People are still digging out, still checking on neighbors. The Petersons' cabin is listing badly. The southeast corner dropped almost 4 inches when the ground heaved. They are alive, but they cannot stay there. One more hard freeze and the whole structure will twist apart. And the Olsons?
Lost their roof. The sod froze solid, then cracked when the temperature swung. Great chunks of it fell into the cabin during the second night. Hans moved his family to the barn with the livestock. They are alive, but 2 of his cows froze standing up. He had to butcher them where they stood because the bodies were frozen to the ground. Rolfson looked around the cabin then, at the tight walls, the level floor, the door that hung perfectly true in its frame, the complete absence of cracks or gaps or signs of distress. His eyes stopped on the base of the walls, where the lowest logs sat on the stone piers, with 18 inches of air between the wood and the frozen ground. Your cabin is the only one in 3 miles that is not damaged, he said. Ingrid nodded. She did not feel triumph. She felt sick. I need help, she said. Eric is sick. He has fever and a cough in his chest. He needs medicine, and I cannot leave Maya alone to get it. Rolfson pushed himself up from the stool where he had been sitting, steadier now, the warmth having done its work. I will go to Fergus Falls. My skis will make the trip faster than walking. 2 days there and back, maybe 3 if the weather turns. He looked toward the bed where Eric lay sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Can you hold until then? I can hold. You have enough wood? Enough. Barely. Rolfson walked to the door, then stopped with his hand on the latch. He turned back to face her. Your rock pile, he said quietly. It worked. It worked. I told you that you would fail. I told you your children would freeze. I was wrong. You were trying to protect us. You had seen what winter could do. I had seen what winter could do to cabins built the way I built mine. I had not seen. He gestured at the stone piers, at the gap between floor and ground, at the whole strange structure that every neighbor had mocked. I had not seen this. He opened the door, letting in a blast of cold that made the stove flames shudder. Haugen owes you an apology. Haugen owes me nothing. He came to the raising bee. That was more than most. Rolfson nodded once, pulled his scarf up over his face, and walked out into the white silence of the frozen world. Ingrid watched him until he was just a dark speck against the snow, growing smaller, heading south toward town. Then she closed the door, checked on Eric, and sat down to wait. So the next 4 days were the longest of Ingrid's life. Eric's fever rose and fell in waves, climbing toward delirium in the dark hours of the night, dropping back to something almost normal when the pale winter sun crept above the horizon. She dosed him with willow bark tea, the only medicine she had, brewed from bark she had stripped from trees along the creek in the fall and dried in bundles by the stove. It helped with the fever, but did nothing for the cough, that terrible wet rattling in his chest that sounded more like Lars every hour. She slept in snatches, her body curled on the floor beside the bed, jerking awake every time Eric's breathing changed or Maya whimpered in her sleep. She fed the stove with mechanical precision, counting logs, calculating hours, watching her woodpile shrink and praying the weather would hold. Maya helped without being asked. At 7 years old, she had absorbed the reality of their situation with a clarity that broke Ingrid's heart. She brought water from the bucket by the stove. She fed small sticks to the fire when her mother was too exhausted to stand. She read aloud from the single book they owned, a Norwegian Bible that had belonged to Ingrid's grandmother, the leather cover cracked and worn from generations of hands, while her brother drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Her voice was thin and high in the cold cabin, the old words of David's psalms filling the silence between gusts of wind. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, Maya read, stumbling over the archaic phrases, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Eric coughed and coughed and coughed. The temperature stayed below 0.
On the second day after Rolfsson left, it dropped to 41 below, and Ingrid heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a sharp crack from somewhere outside like a rifle shot. She threw open the door and saw a split running down the trunk of the nearest cottonwood, the wood literally exploding as the moisture inside it froze and expanded faster than the fibers could absorb. The tree had survived 100 Minnesota winters. This one had finally broken it. She thought about the Hendricksons' cabin, the logs cracking apart as the foundation heaved. She thought about the gap you could put your fist through. She thought about Sigrid Hendrickson's blue ribbon. Then she closed the door and went back to watching her son breathe. On the third day, the wind picked up again. Not as fierce as the blizzard, Ingrid did not think anything could be as fierce as that first assault, but steady and cutting, driving snow crystals against the walls with a sound like sand thrown against glass. The gaps in other cabins would be screaming now, she knew. Every crack, every failed joint, every place where frost heave had broken the seal between foundation and wall would be letting in the killing cold. She learned later that the Peterson cabin collapsed entirely during this second blow. The southeast corner, already dropped 4 inches by the first heave, gave way completely when a drift piled against the weakened wall. The family barely escaped, Martha Peterson pulling her 3 children through the door as the roof caved in behind them, and they stumbled through the storm to Rolfsson's place, 2 miles through waist-deep snow, arriving more dead than alive with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But in the moment, Ingrid knew only the small world of her own cabin, the crackle of the fire, the rasp of Eric's breathing, the howl of the wind against walls that did not crack, the stone piers holding firm beneath the floor while the frozen earth heaved and buckled all around them. Rolfsson returned on the 5th day. She saw him coming from the window, a dark figure against the snow, moving slowly, his sled heavier than when he had left. He had to stop twice to rest before he reached her door, his body pushed beyond exhaustion by the journey. He brought medicine from a doctor in Fergus Falls, a bottle of dark liquid that smelled of camphor and something bitter, with instructions written on a scrap of paper. 1 spoonful every 4 hours, keep him warm, keep him drinking water, pray. Eric fought the medicine. The taste made him gag, and he was weak enough now that even swallowing took effort. Ingrid held him upright, tipping the spoon past his cracked lips, stroking his throat to help him swallow, whispering encouragements in Norwegian and English, and a private language that only mothers and children understand. By the 2nd dose, his fever had begun to drop. By the 3rd, he was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, his breathing still rough, but no longer that terrible drowning rattle. By morning, his eyes were clear when he woke, and he asked for food. Ingrid put her face in her hands and wept. Rolfsson stayed while she cried, saying nothing, his presence a steady warmth in the cold cabin. When she finally looked up, wiping her eyes with the hem of her apron, he was staring at the wall as if seeing something far away. "The death toll is still being counted," he said, "but it is bad. At least 200 dead across Dakota Territory and Minnesota, maybe 300, maybe more. The Signal Corps says it might be the worst blizzard since the territory was settled. They're calling it the schoolhouse blizzard, because so many of the dead were children, caught outside when the storm hit, walking home from school, playing in yards and fields. They had no warning. The morning was warm. They went outside without coats." He paused. But dozens of families also died in their homes. Trapped. The cold got in faster than any fire could fight it. Like the Hendricksons. Like the Hendricksons, and others. The Svenssons south of Fergus Falls, the Mullers east of Alexandria, a family named Brandt that no one had even met yet. They arrived in November and kept to themselves. The husband was found frozen at the stove, still feeding it wood, as if he could not understand why the fire was not keeping them warm. Ingrid thought about all those cabins, all those foundations built the standard way, logs on packed earth, flat stones at the corners. All those walls cracking open as the frost heaved the ground beneath them. All those families watching the gaps appear, feeling the cold pour in, burning everything they owned in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Brennan is telling everyone he predicted this, Rolfson added, his voice going flat. He is riding through the territory, surveying the damage, offering to buy abandoned claims for 50 cents on the dollar. He says the settlers who died were unprepared. He says they should have taken his loans and built proper cabins. Ingrid felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden. The Hendricksons had a proper cabin. They built the way everyone builds. They built the way Brennan told them to build. That is why they are dead. I know. And Brennan's loans would not have helped them. More lumber on the same bad foundation would have cracked and heaved just the same. Better windows and a finer stove mean nothing when the walls split open. I know. Sigrid Hendrickson was 4 years old. She had a blue ribbon in her hair. She is dead because her father trusted the advice of men like Brennan, and that advice was wrong. Rolfson said nothing. There was nothing to say. They sat in silence while Eric slept his healing sleep and Maya dozed in the corner, exhausted by days of fear and vigilance. Outside, the temperature had climbed to 22 below zero, almost warm by the standards of the past week. The sun was shining for the first time in days, its pale light streaming through the greased paper window, casting dim shadows on the cabin floor. The Olsons want to see your foundation, Rolfson said finally. When the weather breaks enough to travel, they want to understand how you built it. I will show them. Haugen, too. He has not said so directly, but I can tell. His door will not close at all now. He has been nailing blankets over the frame to block the gap. The whole cabin is twisted. You can see daylight through the corner joints. I will show him too. Rolfson nodded slowly. He looked around the cabin one more time, at the walls that had not cracked, the floor that had not heaved, the door that still swung freely on its leather hinges. You should know, he said. People are talking about the widow on the rock pile, about how her cabin is the only one for miles that is not damaged. They called you a fool in the fall. They said you were wasting time that would cost your children their lives. He almost smiled, the first time Ingrid had seen anything like a smile on his weathered face since the blizzard began. They are not laughing anymore. February came gray and bitter, but the worst of the cold had passed. Temperatures that had seemed unbearable in October, 10 below, 15 below, now felt almost mild after the horrors of January. The body adapts, Ingrid learned. The mind recalibrates. What would have been terrifying before becomes merely uncomfortable once you have survived something worse. Her woodpile dwindled steadily, a cord and a half after the blizzard, a cord by mid-February. 3/4 of a cord, then half, the stacks of split logs shrinking against the cabin's north wall like snow melting in spring. She burned as little as possible, kept the cabin barely above freezing during the short hours of daylight, trusted her tight walls and level floor to hold what heat the stove provided. Eric recovered slowly. The cough lingered for weeks, a dry rattle that made Ingrid's heart clench every time she heard it, but the fever did not return. He grew stronger day by day, playing quiet games with Maya on the cabin floor, venturing outside when the weather permitted, his small body rebuilding itself with the resilience of children everywhere. The Olsons came first, in the 3rd week of February, during a warm spell that pushed temperatures above zero for 3 consecutive days. Hans Olsen was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with hands like shovels, and a face that rarely showed expression. His wife Marta walked a step behind him, as was proper for Norwegian farm wives of her generation, her eyes taking in everything while her mouth said nothing. They had lost half their livestock in the blizzard. The 2 cows that froze standing up, a dozen chickens that simply stopped moving and never started again, a horse that broke its leg trying to escape the collapsed barn roof and had to be put down with an axe because ammunition was too precious to waste. They had survived by moving into what remained of the barn and huddling with the surviving animals, sharing warmth with cows and pigs, while the temperature dropped to 40 below. Now they stood in Ingrid's cabin, looking around at the undamaged walls, the level floor, the door that closed perfectly in its frame. Hans got down on his knees and peered at the gap between the lowest log and the ground, that 18 inches of air that everyone had mocked, that Haugen had called a waste of time, that Brennan had said would be her gravestone. "No ice," Hans said. "No heave marks on the piers." "The air gap prevents it," Ingrid explained. She had been preparing for this moment, rehearsing the explanation in her head, trying to find simple words for what her father had taught her in Norwegian 20 years ago. Water cannot wick up from the ground into the wood because there is nothing to wick through, just air. Ice cannot form against the stones because the water drains through the gaps between them instead of pooling and freezing. The whole cabin floats above the damage. The frost heaves the ground, but the ground is not touching the cabin, so the cabin does not move. Hans stood and brushed dirt from his knees. He exchanged a look with Marta, one of those silent conversations that long-married couples conduct with their eyes. "My grandfather built like this in Sweden," he said slowly. "Piers of stacked stone, the barn raised above the ground. I thought it was old country foolishness, something they did in the mountains where the soil was thin. I did not think it mattered here, where the earth is deep and rich." "The earth here is worse," Ingrid said. "The glaciers left soil that holds water like a sponge. When that water freezes, the ice pushes up through the ground with terrible force. I have read that scientists measure pressures of many tons per square foot, enough to lift buildings, enough to crack stone walls. But not enough to lift a building that is not touching the ground." "Exactly." Hans walked around the cabin one more time, stopping at each pier, bending down to examine the fitted stones. When he came back to where Ingrid stood, his face had changed. Something had shifted behind his eyes, an understanding settling into place, a recognition of knowledge he had possessed all along but had been taught to dismiss. "Will you show me how to build the piers?" he asked. "In the spring, when the ground thaws. I'm going to rebuild the barn first, then a new cabin. This time I will do it right." "I will show you. I will show anyone who wants to learn." Marta spoke for the first time then, her voice soft but steady. "We cannot pay you. We have lost too much." Ingrid shook her head. "I do not want payment. The knowledge was given to me freely by my father. I will give it freely to anyone who asks." Haugen came the following week, when another brief thaw made the 3/4-mile walk possible without snowshoes. He brought a sack of flour as a gift, 20 pounds, worth more than $1 at Brennan's prices, and presented it gruffly, not meeting Ingrid's eyes. "For the children," he said. "I heard the boy was sick." "He's better now." "Thank you." Haugen nodded and stood awkwardly in the doorway, as if unsure whether to enter. Ingrid stepped aside and gestured him in. He walked slowly around the cabin, examining everything, his eyes lingering on the walls where other cabins would have shown cracks, on the floor where other cabins would have heaved, on the door that still swung freely when every other door in the territory was stuck or jammed or nailed shut against gaps that could not be sealed. He spent longest at the foundation. Like Hans, he got down on his knees to peer at the stone piers, at the careful fit of the unmortared rocks, at the air gap that separated the cabin from the frozen ground. Unlike Hans, he stayed there for a long time, his face hidden, his shoulders tense. When he finally stood, his eyes were wet. "I called you a fool," he said. His voice was rough, as if the words were being dragged out of him by force. "I told you your children would pay for your stubbornness. I told you that your rock pile would be your gravestone. You did. I was wrong." The admission seemed to cost him something. Pride, perhaps, or the certainty that had carried him through 4 years of frontier hardship. "You were right, and I was wrong, and I have spent the last month lying awake at night, thinking about the Hendricksons, thinking about their children, thinking about how I told Anders to build fast and not worry about foundations because that was how everyone built." Ingrid said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make it better. "I did not kill them," Hogan continued, his voice breaking slightly. "The cold killed them. The blizzard killed them. But the cold got in because their foundation heaved, and their foundation heaved because they built the way I told them to build. Fast. Cheap. Logs on packed earth with cornerstones for spacing. I gave that advice to every new settler who asked, because that was the advice I was given when I arrived, and I thought I was helping them." He looked around the cabin again, at the solid walls, the level floor, the evidence of survival in every undamaged joint. "I was not helping them. I was teaching them to build coffins." "You taught them what you knew," Ingrid said quietly. "You had no way of knowing it would fail." "I should have known. My grandfather built like this." He gestured at the stone piers. "In Telemark, in the mountains where the winters were hard. He raised his cabin above the ground on stone pillars, and I asked him why when I was a boy, and he explained about frost and ice and the movement of the earth. I knew, and I forgot, because I came to America and everyone told me the old ways were obsolete." He met her eyes for the first time since he had entered the cabin. "I will not forget again. I will build properly from now on, and I will tell everyone who asks to build the same way. I cannot bring back the Hendricksons, but maybe I can prevent the next family from dying the same death." He stayed for dinner, thin soup made with the flour he had brought, stretched with potatoes and wild onions from Ingrid's dwindling stores. He talked for hours about his grandfather's farm in Telemark, about the stone buildings that had stood for generations, about the knowledge he had dismissed as old country superstition when he first arrived in Minnesota. "We thought we were smarter," he said. "All of us who came from the old country. We thought America was a new land where the old rules did not apply. We looked at the Americans building their cabins on the bare ground, and we thought, they have been here longer, they must know what they are doing. We did not consider that they had been building badly for generations, and simply accepting the damage as normal." He shook his head. "The earth does not care what country you are in. The ice forms the same way in Minnesota as it does in Norway. The frost heaves with the same force. The only difference is that in Norway, our grandfathers learned from 1,000 years of winters. In America, the settlers have been here for 1 generation, maybe 2. They have not had time to learn, and so they keep making the same mistakes, and they keep dying, and they blame the cold instead of their own ignorance." When he left, he shook Ingrid's hand, a formal gesture, deliberate and sincere, as if sealing a contract. "Thank you," he said, "for showing me what I should have remembered. Thank my father. He taught me when I was a child. I simply did not forget." Spring came slowly to the Minnesota prairie. The snow retreated in patches, revealing the damage the winter had done. Collapsed barns, listing cabins, fence posts pushed sideways by the frost, fields scarred by heave and rupture. The earth had moved during those terrible months, shifted and buckled under pressures no structure built on its surface could withstand. Ingrid walked her property in late March, checking for damage, planning the season ahead. The stone piers stood exactly where she had built them, exactly as level as the day she had fitted the last stone into place. The cabin sat above them, solid and true, the only structure for miles that had not been twisted or cracked or destroyed by the winter that had killed so many. And everywhere she walked, the ground was offering her stones. It was the same phenomenon that had provided her building material in the first place, frost heave pushing glacial erratics to the surface, churning up buried rocks with every freeze-thaw cycle. The farmers cursed these stones. They broke plows. They had to be cleared from fields every spring, dragged to the edges and piled in walls that served no purpose except to mark where the nuisance had been dumped.
But Ingrid looked at those stones and saw foundations. She saw cabins that would stand for 50 years instead of 5. She saw families that would survive winters that would kill their neighbors. She saw knowledge that had traveled 5,000 miles from a mountain village in Norway to a frozen prairie in Minnesota, carried in the memory of a girl who had watched her father work and never forgotten what she learned. Hans Olsen came in early April with his 2 oldest sons, strong boys of 16 and 14 who could lift stones that their mother could barely move. Ingrid walked them around her foundation, explaining each step, how to select stones with flat surfaces, how to fit them together without mortar so the structure could flex without cracking, how to taper the piers so the weight pressed down and locked everything in place. The Olsen boys learned quickly. By the end of the first week, they had built a pier that was rough but solid, good enough to support a corner of the new barn their father was planning. Hans stood back and looked at it, his weathered face showing something that might have been hope. "It will hold," he said. It was not a question. "It will hold," Ingrid confirmed. "Build the rest the same way, and your barn will still be standing when your grandsons are old men." More families came as spring progressed. Haugen sent 3 new settlers who had arrived after the blizzard and were terrified of making the mistakes that had killed so many. Word spread through the Norwegian and Swedish settlements along the Alexandria moraine, then further to the German communities to the south and the mixed settlements along the railroad lines. A man named Lindqvist came from Fergus Falls to see the widow's cabin, the one everyone was talking about. He was a builder by trade, a carpenter who had put up a dozen houses in town and considered himself an expert in frontier construction. He walked around Ingrid's foundation 3 times, saying nothing, his face unreadable. "This is not how we build in America," he said finally. "No," Ingrid agreed. "That is why American buildings fail." Lindqvist stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark of surprise. "You are right," he said. "I've spent 10 years building houses that crack and heave and need repairs every spring. I thought that was simply how things were. I did not consider that it might be how things were because I was building badly." He stayed for 3 days, learning the dry stone technique, taking notes in a small leather book, asking questions that showed he understood the principles even as he struggled with the practice. When he left, he shook Ingrid's hand. "I'm going to change how I build," he said. "Not everyone will pay for the extra work, but some will. The ones who can afford it, the ones who have seen what happens when foundations fail. That is all I ask. Teach the ones who will listen. The others will learn when winter comes again." By summer's end, 15 new structures in Ottertail County sat on dry stone pier foundations, cabins and barns, and a small church in a settlement called New Norway, where the congregation had voted unanimously to build the way their ancestors had built in the old country. The following year, there were 40. The year after that, the technique had spread to 3 neighboring counties, carried by settlers who had seen the evidence with their own eyes. Not everyone adopted it. Many settlers still built the fast way, the cheap way, logs on packed earth because that was how it had always been done. Some of them got lucky, mild winters with shallow frost penetration that did not heave their foundations badly enough to cause collapse. Others were not so fortunate. The winter of 1889 killed 17 people in Otter Tail County alone, most of them in cabins that had survived the schoolhouse blizzard, but could not survive the accumulated damage of 2 hard years. But the ones who had learned from Ingrid, the ones who had seen her cabin standing perfect while their neighbors' homes cracked and twisted, those families survived. And they taught their children, and their children taught their children, and the knowledge that had traveled from Norway to Minnesota continued to spread, one stone foundation at a time. The last visitor came in early June, when the prairie had finally warmed enough to feel like summer, and the wildflowers were blooming in the meadows that the plow had not yet reached. Silas Brennan rode up to Ingrid's cabin on a fine black horse, his coat spotless despite the dust of the road, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern that did not reach his eyes. He had not visited since the previous summer, when he had offered her a predatory loan and told her that her rock pile would be her gravestone. "Mrs. Torstad," he said, not dismounting, "I came to see how you fared through the winter." Ingrid stood in her doorway, her children playing behind her in the cabin that had saved their lives. She did not invite him in. "As you can see, Mr. Brennan, I fared well." Brennan looked at the cabin. His eyes moved slowly over the undamaged walls, the door that still closed true, the stone piers visible beneath the structure. His face remained pleasant, but something flickered in his expression, calculation, perhaps, or resentment. "So I see. Your foundation seems to have performed as you hoped." "It performed as I knew it would." "Indeed." Brennan shifted in his saddle. "I have heard that you have been teaching others to build in this manner, the stone pier technique, the Norwegian method." "Anyone who asks. I do not charge for the knowledge." "How generous." His voice was flat. "Of course, the settlers you teach will not need to buy lumber from the mill in Fergus Falls. They will not need to take loans to afford proper construction materials. They will simply stack rocks like peasants in the old country and trust that their grandmother's superstitions will keep them safe." Ingrid felt her temper rise but kept her voice steady. "Their grandmother's superstitions kept me and my children alive, while the families who followed your advice froze to death. The Hendricksons built the way you told them to build. They are dead. Their children are dead. Their cabin is a pile of broken logs." Brennan's pleasant mask slipped slightly. "I did not tell the Hendricksons how to build. They made their own choices. They made the choices everyone makes, because everyone builds badly and no one tells them differently. You extend credit for lumber and nails and glass windows, and you foreclose when the cabins crack and the families cannot make their payments. You profit from failure. Mr. Brennan, that is your business model." Brennan stared at her. The mask was fully gone now, replaced by something cold and sharp. "You are a stubborn woman, Mrs. Torstad. Your husband was the same way. He refused my loan when he first arrived. He said he would prove up his claim without debt, without help, without acknowledging that he needed what I could provide. And now he is dead, and you are here alone, teaching techniques that undermine the entire system of credit that keeps this territory functioning. My husband died of pneumonia, not stubbornness. And yet here you are, surviving where others fail, spreading knowledge that costs me money with every cabin that does not crack." Brennan leaned forward in his saddle. "Do you think the banks will look kindly on a woman who helps settlers avoid debt? Do you think the lumber mills will thank you for teaching people to build without their products? You are making enemies, Mrs. Torstad,
powerful enemies who do not appreciate a Norwegian widow, undermining their livelihood. Ingrid stepped forward out of her doorway, close enough to Brennan's horse that the animal shifted nervously under her gaze. "The Hendrickson children are dead," she said, her voice low and even. Sigrid Hendrickson was 4 years old. She had a blue ribbon in her hair. She froze to death in her mother's arms because her father built a cabin on a foundation that heaved. "I will not stop teaching because it inconveniences your profits. I will not stop teaching because the lumber mills sell less wood. I will not stop teaching because you or anyone else threatens me." She looked up at him, this man in his fine clothes on his fine horse, this predator who circled the territory looking for families to consume. "I will teach anyone who wants to learn. I will teach them for free. And if that makes me your enemy, Mr. Brennan, then I suggest you learn to live with enemies, because I am not going anywhere, and neither is the knowledge I carry." Brennan held her gaze for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His hands were white on the reins. Then he turned his horse and rode away without another word. He never came back. Ingrid Torstad proved up her claim in 1892, 5 years after arriving on the land as a widow, with $9 and 2 children. The final proof papers, filed at the land office in Fergus Falls and witnessed by Gunnar Rolfsson and Petter Hogan, listed a 16 by 20-foot cabin, 23 acres of broken sod, a small barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar, and the dry stone pier foundation that had saved her family's lives. She never remarried, though 3 men asked over the years, farmers who had seen her cabin survive the blizzard, and thought a woman with such knowledge would make a practical wife. She declined them all. The cabin was hers. The land was hers. She had built them with her own hands, and she would hold them the same way. Maya and Eric grew up on that homestead, learning to read and write in English and Norwegian, walking 3 miles to the schoolhouse that opened in 1895, coming home each evening to help with chores and listen to their mother's stories about Norway. Maya became a teacher herself, first in a one-room schoolhouse in Ottertail County, then in Fergus Falls, where she taught children of the settlers who had learned dry stone construction from her mother. She married a Swedish farmer named Lindqvist, a nephew of the carpenter who had visited that first spring, and raised 4 children who all knew how to stack stones without mortar. Eric took over the farm when he came of age, adding acreage over the years, building a second cabin for his own family using the techniques his mother had taught him. He worked that land until his death in 1931, and his children worked it after him, and the original cabin, the one Ingrid had built in 1887, stood at the center of the property like a monument to stubbornness. Ingrid lived to see the new century arrive. She watched automobiles replace horses on the roads that had once been wagon tracks. She saw telephone lines stretch across the prairie, and electric lights appear in Fergus Falls, and airplanes pass overhead on their way to somewhere else. She heard the news of wars in Europe that seemed impossibly distant from her quiet corner of Minnesota, and she remembered her father's stories of his own grandfather's wars. And she thought about how the world changed while certain things, stone and ice and the movement of the earth, stayed exactly the same. She kept teaching the dry stone technique to anyone who asked, though by the 1920s, most new construction used poured concrete foundations that reached below the frost line. The modern solution was easier to build and required less skill, though it was not necessarily better. Ingrid saw plenty of concrete crack and heave when it was poured too shallow or in the wrong kind of soil. But the old knowledge was fading, replaced by new knowledge that would eventually be replaced by something newer still. She died in her sleep on January 9th, 1909, in the cabin she had built with her own hands 22 years before. The temperature that night was 31 degrees below zero, a hard cold, though not as hard as the schoolhouse blizzard, not as hard as the night Lars had died. The door still closed true. The walls still stood level. The stone piers still held.
Her neighbors found her the next morning when the smoke stopped rising from her chimney and no one answered their knocks. She was peaceful in her bed, her face calm, her hands folded over the quilt that Marta Olsen had sewn for her 10th winter on the claim. They buried her in the churchyard at New Norway, next to an empty grave she had kept for Lars. His body had remained in Fargo, too expensive to move, but she had always meant to bring him home someday and never had the heart to do it. The cabin stood for another 40 years after her death. Eric used it as a storage building after he built his own house. Then it became a chicken coop. Then it was abandoned entirely when the family built a modern farmhouse closer to the road, with indoor plumbing and electricity, and a poured concrete foundation that a contractor from Fergus Falls installed in 2 days. It finally collapsed in a windstorm in 1953. The logs rotted through after 66 years. The roof caved in, the walls fallen outward like the petals of a dead flower. But the stone piers still stood, 8 pillars of fitted granite and gneiss, exactly level, exactly where Ingrid Torstad had placed them in the summer of 1887 when she was a widow with $9 and 2 children and a knowledge that everyone said was worthless. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 53 degrees in 7 hours. Gunnar Rolfsson, who had survived 4 Minnesota winters and buried a wife and infant son to the cold, had looked at the widow with her 2 small children and told her plainly, "If you stay here, they will watch you fail, and then they will freeze." Ingrid Torstad stayed. Her children did not watch her fail. They did not freeze. The last frost heave of that terrible winter pushed another stone to the surface of her east field, right where the plow would hit it in spring. She walked out one morning in early April, the mud sucking at her boots, the sun warm on her face for the first time in months. She found the stone there, a flat piece of granite, gray and speckled, perfectly shaped for the base of a pier. She bent down, worked her fingers under the edge, and lifted it free of the earth. It was heavy. Her back ached. Her hands were still rough from the winter, still healing from the months of cold and work and survival. She carried the stone to the pile by the barn and set it down with the others. Someday someone would need to build another foundation. Someday another family would come to this land and need to learn what she had learned from her father. The earth would keep offering stones. She would keep gathering them. That was how knowledge survived, passed from hand to hand, stone by stone, one stubborn life at a time.